My brother got the family business, while I was handed just $20 and told to find my own way. I always imagined living in small-town America meant you'd live a simple, drama-free life. Like you spend your days greeting neighbors at the local grocery store, maybe hold a weekend barbecue, and call it good. But for me, it turned into a whole mess of complicated family stuff, especially once our beloved restaurant got thrown into the mix. I'm Logan, 22 years old. I rent this cramped, no-frills apartment that I try to keep from looking like a permanent yard sale. My living space basically does triple duty: bedroom, storage closet, and what I like to call my office, which is really just a corner of the room where my rickety desk stands. I've got a second-hand TV that flickers every time a car honks outside, a futon that squeaks if I breathe too hard, and a mini fridge that sometimes decides to defrost itself in the middle of the night. It's not exactly a dream, but at least I don't have my parents watching my every move. Speaking of parents, my folks own the most famous restaurant in our city. It's basically the local landmark where folks come for fried chicken that some people swear is life-changing. They got a mention in a few local travel guides, and now random road trippers show up claiming they've heard it's the best pit stop in the state. The place has been around for decades, passed down through my family line. You'd think that'd make me proud, and in a way, I guess it is, but I've never really felt like an heir to that legacy. My older brother, Austin, 25, practically lives like the star of his own reality show. He's still at my parents' big white house that has the perfect front lawn and a fancy grill that probably costs more than my entire apartment's furniture. He's got all the space in the world, a huge bedroom, his own gaming setup, and enough closet room for clothes I'm sure he never even wears. Meanwhile, I'm over here, carefully stacking my textbooks so they won't collapse on me while I sleep. You might wonder why I left home in the first place. Well, it's not that I don't love my family, but from an early age, I was basically the behind-the-scenes guy in our restaurant. My dad said it would teach me discipline to wash dishes, peel potatoes, and scrub floors day after day. At first, I bought it. I thought, okay, this is how you learn the value of work. But as the years passed, I noticed Austin was the one chatting with customers, shaking hands with local politicians, and posing for pictures with traveling foodies. Meanwhile, I was just trying not to burn my hands on hot pans. I can't count how many times I stayed late to help the short-staffed kitchen, only to find out Austin was off enjoying some social event with my parents or wooing potential investors for a restaurant expansion. Even the staff noticed the difference. Austin was being groomed as the next big thing, and I was, well, the help. Whenever I tried suggesting ideas, like a new dish or a special weekend promotion, my parents would nod politely, then tell me to finish restocking the condiments. After a while, you stop bothering with ideas altogether. Finally, a couple years ago, I scrounged up enough money to rent my own place. My parents called it betrayal, claiming I was abandoning them. But come on, I was done feeling like a live-in employee. That's how I ended up here, in my cozy shoebox apartment, surrounded by neighbors who argue loudly in the hallway at 2 a.m. At least I can be messy on my own terms, right? So, a couple of weeks ago, my parents dropped a bombshell by inviting the entire family, plus a few curious relatives, to a very important meeting. I remember Austin giving me that smirk as I walked in, like he already knew something I didn't. I tried not to read too much into it. A tiny part of me clung to a naive hope that maybe, just maybe, my parents were going to say they valued both of us equally, that we'd both inherit something of significance. Well, let's just say that didn't exactly pan out. My mom and dad gave a heartfelt speech about how the restaurant's legacy needed a new leader. They showered Austin with praises, how he'd proven himself at the cash register, how he'd handled negotiations with local farmers, all that jazz. Then they glanced at me and dropped the classic "Logan's a dreamer" line. They said they loved that about me, but felt the restaurant needed someone practical to guide it forward. That alone was a gut punch, but it got worse. They turned to me with solemn expressions, like they were presenting me with a consolation prize. My cousin slid an envelope across the table. I opened it, and inside was a single $20 bill. My mother insisted it was meant to help me find my own path. My dad murmured something about how I shouldn't let my creativity go to waste, and how maybe I'd do better doing something else, far away from the family business. Austin was just grinning, basking in the glory of his new official title, as the one who inherited everything. If a tumbleweed had blown through the room right then, I wouldn't have been surprised. The rest of the evening was an awkward parade of congratulations for Austin, with me sitting on the sidelines clutching an envelope that wouldn't even buy a decent dinner for two. My cousin tried to offer a sympathetic look, but it was overshadowed by the general fanfare around Austin's big promotion. I felt my face get hot, like I was a walking embarrassment. Part of me wanted to toss that envelope on the floor and storm out, but I was too stunned to make a scene. I just felt small. Eventually, I mustered the energy to leave. Walking out of that restaurant was like walking out a giant spotlight that had never actually shined on me. The sky had opened up, dumping rain on the parking lot, which felt like a Hollywood-level dramatic setting for my exit. My shoes squelched with each step, and my clothes clung to me like cling wrap at a backyard cookout. On top of the humiliation, now I had to deal with being soaked. Despite the downpour, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was like I'd finally gotten some closure. Terrible closure, but closure all the same. They'd picked their favorite child. Fine, let them. As I hopped into my ancient sedan with the peeling paint, I realized I was free in a way I'd never been before. No more waiting around for them to toss me a bone. No more playing second fiddle to Austin's star turn in front of the local press. I drove off, leaving the flickering neon sign of the restaurant behind me. The wipers squeaked like an out-of-tune orchestra, but the sound was oddly comforting. Every revolution of the tires took me farther from that suffocating sense of being the family's not-quite-good-enough sidekick. Anger simmered in my gut, but so did a new spark of determination. If they thought I was only worth $20, then maybe I'd turn that into the biggest, most unexpected success story they'd ever seen. My apartment felt like a safe haven when I finally got there, though it probably smells like old carpet and microwave popcorn to visitors. I kicked off my soaked sneakers at the door and flopped onto my futon, letting out a long, shaky breath. My phone was buzzing in my pocket, probably text from relatives, or maybe from Austin gloating about his new domain. I couldn't deal with it, so I just let it ring. The overhead light flickered, reminding me that I still had a landlord to call, but at least that's a problem on my own terms. I stared at that $20 bill, all wrinkled from my damp hands and the rainy trek. Honestly, it felt like a cheap punchline to a bad joke. But you know what? It was also the symbol of a turning point. No more illusions that I'd somehow become a partner in that old family business. Now, I'd have to build my own future from the ground up. And yeah, maybe it's terrifying not knowing where my next big opportunity will come from, but it's also liberating. I can do my own thing. Maybe I'll check out some culinary courses. Who says I can't cook better chicken than them someday, right? Or maybe I'll go in a completely different direction and start a food vlog or design t-shirts or open a coffee truck. The possibilities are endless when you're not tethered to one place and one set of expectations. That night, the rain kept tapping on my windows like it was trying to say, "Hey, buddy, you're on your own now, but that's okay." I lay there on my squeaky futon, letting exhaustion and frustration melt into a sort of cautious hope. Sure, my parents made their choice. Let Austin be the restaurant king. I'm not going to let it define who I am or what I can do. So yeah, that's the moment I truly walked away from a family business that never really wanted me. It's not the warm, fuzzy ending some folks might hope for, but it's real. And if I've learned anything from slinging dishes and scrubbing floors, it's that hard work can carry you pretty far. I woke up the next day feeling like my brain was stuck in first gear. The previous night had been a whirlwind of thoughts about my family, the restaurant, and my future. I tried to push all that aside and focus on something else, but no amount of half-hearted scrolling through phone apps did the trick. My apartment felt like it was closing in, so I decided to take a long walk through the city once the sun went down. It seemed like the only way to clear my head without staring at the same four walls. My neighborhood sits on the edge of a bigger downtown area that never truly sleeps. After a few blocks, the scattered streetlights turn into a line of neon signs advertising diners, pawn shops, and convenience stores. I passed a couple of college kids who were laughing about a party that apparently went off the rails the previous night. They were practically bouncing with energy, which felt like a stark contrast to my drained state. As I strolled along the uneven sidewalk, I kept thinking about how my entire life had changed overnight. Part of me wanted to prove a point to my family, maybe launch a successful venture and show them I wasn't just a daydreamer. Another part of me just wanted to breathe, to do something completely unrelated to fried chicken or balancing a cash register. My feet took me block after block, beneath flickering street lamps and past a hum of late-night traffic. The city was a weird mix of possibilities and emptiness at that hour. I could hear a constant rumble of cars in the distance, punctuated by the occasional siren, or someone yelling about how they lost their wallet. Eventually, I reached a small fast food joint I'd never noticed before. The sign above the door buzzed like an old television left on too long, and a warm glow spilled onto the sidewalk, cutting through the darkness. It wasn't much to look at, a little hole in the wall with a faded menu board and a single employee behind the counter. But my stomach had started grumbling, and it seemed like the only place open that wasn't a bar or a 24-hour pharmacy. I patted my pocket, remembering I barely had any cash. The day before, I'd used a chunk of my spare change on gas. The leftover was basically that single $20 bill, my so-called inheritance. I hesitated, trying to decide if I should actually spend money on late-night burgers or just wait until morning. Then my stomach rumbled loud enough that the guy sweeping the sidewalk outside gave me a curious glance. I took that as a sign that maybe I needed some kind of meal, even if it was cheap and greasy. My plan was to head inside, grab the least expensive combo on the menu, and head home. Simple enough, right? While I stood there, though, I noticed someone sitting near the entrance, tucked against the brick wall. He looked older than me, but not by much, maybe mid-40s. His clothes were rumpled, and he had a half-grown beard, but there was something in his posture that didn't scream the usual image of a person living on the streets. He had a small stack of newspapers at his side, like he'd been reading them or using them for insulation. The strangest thing was a hint of a focused, intelligent expression in his eyes. It felt like he was studying everything around him. I paused, trying not to stare. I was about to move on when he caught my eye. That brief moment of contact felt strangely electric, as if there was a spark in him that refused to fade, no matter how tough his circumstances were. My first instinct was to keep walking. It's not like I had the budget to be handing out money, but something tugged at me. My chest felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the urge to do something kind, even if it was small. I glanced at the window of the little burger joint, then at the man. Instead of walking away or dropping some spare change, I decided to do something else. I walked in and scanned the overhead menu. The place smelled like a mixture of cooking oil and stale coffee, but it was weirdly comforting. I saw they had a deal on burgers, if you bought them in pairs. My mind did some quick math. If I got that combo with 2 burgers, I'd still have enough left over for my next day's grocery run, though it would be tight. The lone cashier was half asleep, but managed to ring me up for 2 burgers. I skipped the fries and a soft drink, figuring I'd be better off saving those extra dollars. After I paid, I stepped aside to wait. The inside of the shop was so quiet, I could hear the sizzle from the griddle in the back. My reflection stared back at me from the window, reminding me of how tired I looked, shadows under my eyes, shoulders slumped. But I felt a faint flicker of satisfaction. At least I was doing something more worthwhile than lying in bed and worrying. When the order was ready, I slipped out onto the sidewalk, balancing the paper bag in one hand. The older man was still there, scanning the night like he was looking for an opportunity or maybe just listening for any signs of trouble. I eased myself down on the curb next to him, leaving a slight gap because I didn't want to invade his personal space. My head was swimming with uncertainty, but I handed him one of the burgers. He gave me this look that was a cross between gratitude and curiosity. We started talking in that cautious, roundabout way people do when they're not sure they can trust each other. He mentioned his name, said it was Henry, and added that life had taken a left turn on him. There was no direct complaining, just an acknowledgement that he'd seen better days. In return, I told him I'd had a rough time recently with family stuff, though I left out the specifics about the restaurant. I felt like I'd been whining all week, and I didn't want to unload that on someone who had even bigger issues on his plate. He reached into a worn backpack and showed me a folder stuffed with faded documents. He said they used to be his pride and joy back when he worked on Wall Street as a business consultant. That detail surprised me because at first glance, I hadn't pegged him for the finance type. His voice carried an odd mix of regret and a certain quiet resolve, like he'd been to the top and now had a perspective most people never gain. He explained he once had a comfortable life, a nice apartment, a spouse who seemed supportive, and a job that paid well enough to enjoy an occasional luxury. Then a messy situation with his family spiraled out of control. His spouse left him for someone wealthier. His family turned cold the moment he couldn't keep handing them cash, and emotional fallout took him down a rabbit hole of depression. He lost his job and eventually ended up on the street. The conversation rattled me in a way I couldn't define. I'd always assumed that losing everything meant you made a series of terrible choices. Maybe that was still partially true, but there was more nuance. Sometimes life deals you a hand that's hard to play, and the people you think will have your back end up walking away. It sounded eerily close to my own experience, just on a different scale. I felt a shiver as I realized how flimsy a support system can be once money or family expectations come into the mix. Henry glanced at me with an expression that was almost amused, like he saw my mind racing. He seemed to pick up on the fact that I was standing at a crossroads in my own life. Maybe it was a hint of desperation clinging to me, or maybe he was just good at reading people. He offered perspective I hadn't considered. He suggested that opportunities are hidden in problems that most folks try to avoid. His eyes lit up when he said it, like he'd stumbled onto a universal truth that gets overlooked by those who still have the cushion of a normal life. I looked at my half-eaten burger and realized how bizarre it was to be sitting on a curb at night, talking business theory with someone who slept under a bridge. He told me he'd tried to bounce back a few times, but job interviews had a way of veering south when potential employers saw his current circumstances. He admitted he wasn't perfect. He'd made mistakes, fallen into a slump, and let depression push him away from people who might have helped. But he still had a mind for strategic planning and financial insight. He even chuckled about the irony that all his high-level knowledge hadn't saved him from the personal crash he'd experienced. We went back and forth, though not in direct quotes, just an exchange of stories. I told him I was fed up with being dismissed as a dreamer. I admitted that I had just enough saved to keep me afloat for maybe another month or two, but no real plan for the future. The idea of spending my days behind a desk or stuck flipping burgers in some other restaurant made me cringe. I knew I wanted to do something that felt meaningful, even if I wasn't sure what that was yet. Henry's suggestion was that real success isn't about leaping onto an already thriving venture. It's about spotting a neglected area or a small spark of potential and turning it into something bigger. He seemed convinced that if I looked in the right place, I'd find an opportunity that nobody else realized was golden. According to him, that's how so many underdogs in business end up surpassing the established players. They go where others refuse to go. I found myself nodding along. There was a strange comfort in hearing that approach, especially from someone who'd once walked the halls of major financial institutions. My mind was already racing with vague ideas, though nothing solid. I picture a rundown storefront that could be transformed into a local gem, or maybe some obscure service people desperately needed but didn't realize it yet. It was all theoretical, but it lit a small flame of hope in my chest. We lingered there, finishing our food, while the city carried on around us. A couple of police cars passed by, their sirens echoing off the tall buildings. An older sedan sputtered to a stop at a nearby traffic light, and I thought about my own car with its peeling paint and questionable brakes. Everything felt surreal. I was a 22-year-old who'd been kicked out of family legacy, huddled on a curb with a man who'd seen success I couldn't even imagine, and we were swapping life lessons like we'd known each other for years. The night air grew colder, so I pulled my hood tighter. He rummaged through his backpack, folding his newspapers more neatly, like he was preparing to find a new place to sleep. I realized I had maybe $5 left in my wallet. It was a pitiful amount, but I wondered if it would help him. Instead, he told me that money wasn't his biggest problem. Lack of a second chance was. He planned to move on from the area soon, maybe hitch a ride to another city, but he was still searching for that one crack in the system where he could wedge his skills and rebuild. Before we parted ways, he repeated that idea about seeking out undervalued opportunities. He pointed out that some folks spend their entire lives waiting for a perfect chance, while others create their own shot out of whatever random pieces they find lying around. He reminded me that if he'd managed to see that spark in me, maybe I needed to see it in myself. I stood up, nodded, and watched him gather his belongings. The streets around us were nearly empty at this point, just a few scattered cars and the distant echo of laughter from a nightclub half a mile away. My thoughts were buzzing, and I couldn't quite process the significance of that chance encounter. It felt bigger than a random talk with a stranger. It felt like an invitation to step onto a different path. The entire walk home, I mulled over Henry's advice. I'd never considered searching for something undervalued, because I'd always assumed I lacked the finances or the know-how. But maybe that was a trick, to find something small enough that I could handle, yet big enough to grow beyond its current state. My family had always told me to keep my imagination in check, but maybe the best thing I could do now was unleash it. By the time I reached my apartment, my head was spinning with possibilities. I imagined old properties that could be flipped, or local events that needed better organization, or random side hustles that could turn into a real career. I had no idea how to refine these thoughts into a concrete plan, but it felt like I was finally moving in a direction that wasn't dictated by my parents or overshadowed by my brother. I stepped inside, greeted by my flickering overhead light once again, and dropped onto my futon. The city night still glowed through my window, painting the walls with a faint orange hue. I glanced at my phone, noticing missed notifications, but decided to leave them be. Instead, I sank into a restless sleep, my mind jumping between images of that burger joint, Henry's determined gaze, and the elusive promise of something overlooked waiting to be discovered. When I woke up the following morning, I still felt the buzz of that conversation. My phone had a few messages from people asking where I'd been. It didn't matter. My thoughts were all about Henry's words. He hadn't handed me a perfect roadmap, just a nudge in the right direction. I realized that maybe I didn't need a polished plan straight away. Maybe I just needed to start looking at the world through a new lens, the possibility lens. All day, I hopped from one idea to another, scribbling down notes on the back of old receipts. Everything felt chaotic, but in a good way. Something told me that I was on the verge of a breakthrough, however small it might be. That spark Henry mentioned was definitely taking root. In a sense, it was almost funny that I'd needed to talk to someone who was down on his luck to see a bigger picture. But that's how life works sometimes. You find clarity in the most unexpected places. By evening, I decided to head back out, determined to walk around and see if anything caught my eye the way Henry suggested. I passed the diner from before, trying to see if maybe Henry was there again, but he wasn't. My guess was that he'd moved on like he said he would. Still, I felt grateful to have crossed paths with him. The memory of that chance meeting fueled me to keep exploring. The city lights flickered to life once more, illuminating old storefronts, some abandoned, some just outdated. I began imagining what each one could become if given a little attention and a dash of ambition. My pockets were almost empty, but my mind felt wide open. I could sense that something good might be waiting beyond the next block or the next conversation, something that would let me take the first real step toward building my own legacy. That sense of anticipation stayed with me, flickering like a neon sign in the back of my thoughts. I had no clue which path to choose, but at least I knew I could choose. My old life felt more and more like a distant memory, overshadowed by the fact that I was finally in charge of my own story. I kept thinking that if a person who'd lost everything could still believe in hidden opportunities, then someone like me, who was starting from a place that wasn't quite rock bottom, might have a fighting chance. I walked until my legs started to ache, taking in every detail of the city. I noticed small corners filled with discarded furniture, empty parking lots with grass peeking through cracks in the concrete, and shuttered shops that had for lease signs gathering dust in the windows. This might have seemed depressing before, but now it looked like a giant puzzle waiting for someone to piece it together. My imagination soared, picturing pop-up markets, art studios, or little community centers that could breathe new life into neglected spaces. Even though I wasn't exactly sure how to turn any of these ideas into reality, I felt a wave of cautious excitement. Henry's words about spotting opportunities where others only see problems repeated in my mind. For the first time in ages, I felt like I had a purpose that didn't revolve around pleasing my parents or living in my brother's shadow. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Some of these places likely had complicated histories, or maybe the property owners wanted more money than I could ever scrape together. But it was a start. I let that sense of possibility carry me onward. Eventually, I headed back home again, the air a little cooler and my mind running in circles of hope. My feet were sore, and my bank account was laughably small, but my perspective on the future felt bigger than it ever had. I was still replaying my chance meeting with Henry, remembering the grit in his voice when he said that success often hides where nobody else bothers to look. It was a simple observation, yet it made all the difference to someone who'd spent too long trying to please people who never gave him a fair shot. I reached the front door of my building, digging for my keys. The hallway light sputtered as if it wanted to give up altogether. The neighbors were bickering about cable bills or something equally trivial. It was a far cry from any kind of glamorous setting, but it felt more real than the world of forced smiles and business suits I'd known at the restaurant. I stepped inside my apartment, letting the door close behind me, and allowed myself a small smile. My life was messy, no doubt, but at least it was my mess, and I was determined to shape it into something worthwhile. Now that I'd seen the possibilities out there, I couldn't go back to sitting still. I rummaged through my desk drawers, searching for an old notebook I'd used in school. My plan was to jot down every idea, no matter how wild. If Henry could rebuild his life after losing everything, maybe I could prove I wasn't just a disposable worker from a family restaurant. A wave of energy coursed through me as I scribbled notes and brainstormed ways to make something out of practically nothing. That night, I barely slept. My mind ran through 1,000 scenarios, flipping each one around in search of a hidden gem. Somewhere deep inside, I believed that the next step was out there, one chance to claim something I could call my own. I couldn't help picturing Henry moving on to another city, sharing his wisdom with someone else who might need it even more than I did. The image gave me hope, like there really were people out there who understood the struggle and still believed in second chances. I told myself I'd be ready. No more waiting for approval or scraps of encouragement. No more letting my brother's achievements overshadow my own potential. The city was full of stories, and I was about to write my own. All I needed was that perfect spark. Some corner of the world waiting for a little push to reveal its value. That was the promise I clung to as I drifted off in the early morning hours, my notebook lying open on my chest. None of this changed my financial situation overnight, of course. I still had to count every penny and ration out my groceries for the coming week. But a subtle shift had happened. I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. The conversation with Henry had unlocked a door in my mind, and I couldn't stop peering through it, wondering which forgotten corner of the city might hold my future. Somewhere in that swirl of thoughts, I finally dozed off, the hum of passing traffic blending with my own excitement. I figured I'd have to push through more challenges before anything truly took shape, but I no longer felt afraid of that reality. It was all part of the process, the grind that makes the payoff sweeter in the end. If I stayed alert, I believed I'd spot the right moment to jump in and make something of my life. And with that, I sank into a restless, but strangely hopeful sleep. I woke up the next morning still juggling all the new thoughts crowding my head, thanks to the midnight wanderings and the conversation that changed my perspective. The city noise drifted into the thin apartment walls, reminding me that another day had officially begun. My phone battery was hovering at a questionably low percentage, but I didn't bother plugging it in. I felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with phone notifications or leftover family drama. I craved a stronger sense of purpose, something to confirm I wasn't crazy for believing in second chances. It must have been mid-morning when I finally pried myself off the futon. My usual routine would have been to eat a boring breakfast and browse for job postings online, but I couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, I decided to walk. Something about the act of stepping outside, breathing the not-so-fresh city air, and reminding myself that life went on around me seemed more vital than checking another job board listing. So I grabbed my jacket, counted what remained of my limited funds, and headed down the building's creaky staircase. The sidewalks were dotted with people hustling to work, clutching coffees and trying not to look too grumpy about it. I wandered past a few shops, half wishing I had the money to splurge on a real breakfast, something more than just a discounted donut from a corner store. Eventually, I noticed a sign for a small cafe. My stomach growled, but I also figured I had to be cautious with my cash. I was in the middle of that internal debate when I spotted a familiar figure near the crosswalk. It took me a second to recognize him, but then I realized it was Henry, the man who'd talked to me about undervalued opportunities. He was leaning against a newspaper dispenser, adjusting the strap of his tattered backpack. I found it unusual to spot him in broad daylight, especially not curled up in some out-of-the-way spot. Without thinking twice, I walked over to greet him. He offered a nod, and there was a flicker of something like relief on his face, maybe because he recognized me. We ended up strolling together, exchanging bits of small talk. He looked less exhausted than the last time I'd seen him, as if the promise of new possibilities had given him a little boost. I mentioned feeling hungry, and he suggested finding coffee and maybe a donut. I decided to treat him this time, recalling how I'd used my last few bucks for those burgers we'd shared days earlier. There was a small bakery not far from us, so we made our way there. It smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon, which immediately put me in a better mood. I paid for 2 coffees and a couple of donuts, mentally bracing for my wallet's protest. Strangely, I didn't feel regret. Something about helping Henry again felt right, like I was investing in positivity. We sat on a bench next to the bakery's window, sipping coffee that was way too hot at first. We started talking the same way we had before, trading life observations without diving into every tragic detail. Henry mentioned he'd been thinking about how to get a small footing back in the world, just enough to show potential employers or potential partners that he could still function like he did in his old corporate life. Then he brought up a straightforward idea he thought might be profitable: scouring garage sales for hidden gems and reselling them online. He admitted it wasn't a revolutionary concept, but he'd seen people do it with shocking success. I mulled it over. The concept of flipping items wasn't entirely new to me. My aunt used to collect spoons from yard sales, though I never understood the appeal. Henry, however, described how some folks discover extremely rare collectibles among everyday junk and sell them for surprising amounts. He emphasized that the key was knowledge, the ability to recognize a potential treasure that others dismiss as garbage. He considered it a small-scale version of how big-time investors spot undervalued assets. He suggested we give a shot as a low-risk experiment. He'd share his insight from years of analyzing markets, and I'd bring whatever hustle I had to offer, along with that last bit of cash I still clung to like a lifeline. I had some skepticism, picturing rummaging through dusty boxes of old VHS tapes and porcelain kittens. But Henry insisted it was worth a try, especially if we ventured into wealthier neighborhoods where people might be offloading valuable items without realizing it. It sounded slightly adventurous, even though I wasn't sure how rummaging through someone's front lawn discount bin would feel. The very next morning, I found myself waiting in my old car outside Henry's makeshift sleeping spot. He climbed in with a determination I hadn't seen before, and we drove to a well-known upscale area. The streets there were lined with houses that had immaculate hedges, wide driveways, and perfectly positioned lawn ornaments. It felt like a different universe compared to my cramped apartment building and Henry's usual haunts. We followed a couple homemade yard sale signs and bright markers until we reached a long, elegant driveway leading to a 2-story house with a big sign that read estate sale. I parked under a leafy tree, and we hopped out. A small crowd was already there, sifting through tables piled with old kitchenware, vintage clothing, and random knickknacks. The home's yard was enormous, and from the looks of furniture on display, ornate chairs, carved wooden cabinets, these folks had owned some expensive stuff. Henry's eyes lit up like he was analyzing the stock market again, scanning every item for potential. I tried to do the same, but I felt a bit awkward rummaging through people's possessions, even if they'd voluntarily put them up for sale. We meandered around, checking price tags that ranged from a couple of dollars to a few hundred. There were old silverware sets, boxes of vinyl records, random tools, and more porcelain figurines than I knew existed. I almost lost Henry in the crowd when he darted toward a corner of the yard where someone had leaned a bunch of frames against a fence. He gestured for me to come over, pointing to one painting in particular. It was a bit dusty, the color seemed faded, and the frame had chipped edges. But the subject matter, a portrait of what looked like an abstract city skyline, caught my eye. The seller apparently wanted $20 for it. Henry gave me a confident nod, suggesting it might be worth far more than that. He believed it could be an early piece from an artist who never hit the mainstream but had a niche following. I felt a pang of doubt because I didn't see anything extraordinary in the painting, but Henry's intuition had got me this far. So I shrugged and told the seller I'd take it. We ended up leaving after that one purchase. I sensed Henry didn't want us burning our limited funds on random junk we couldn't offload. The painting felt like enough of a gamble for one day. On the drive back, he explained how some artists are underappreciated until someone stumbles on their work and gives it the spotlight it deserves. Online auction platforms were filled with collectors who hunted for precisely these hidden treasures. I spent the afternoon cleaning the frame, trying not to damage the painting itself. Then I took a few photos with my phone, found an online marketplace, and set up a listing with an optimistic price. Still nowhere near what established art would fetch, but high enough that I wouldn't just be handing it away. Henry hovered around, offering suggestions on how to phrase the listing to lure serious buyers. He had a sense for marketing angles, clearly the result of his old corporate days. The next few days were surreal. I watched the listing's views climb, but I didn't expect much beyond some mild interest. Then, out of nowhere, bids started rolling in. Each time I refreshed the page, the numbers looked more ridiculous, like I was daydreaming. Eventually, someone made an offer of $15,000. I almost dropped my phone. That was more money than I'd ever seen in one place, let alone from a single painting that I doubted was even worth the original $20. Turned out the artist was gaining recognition in certain circles, and collectors were scrambling to get anything by this name before prices soared even higher. When the sale finally went through, I felt an electric jolt of validation. For the first time in my life, I'd earned a significant chunk of money without punching a clock for someone else, and it wasn't because of dumb luck. It was because I'd trusted someone's insight, taken a risk, and navigated all on my own terms. Even the memory of my family's restaurant didn't dull that sense of accomplishment. Henry had been right about the hidden potential in things everyone else overlooked. My first move after I transferred the funds into my account was to find Henry a better living situation. I knew how precarious his nights on the street had been, so I arranged for him to take over a modest studio apartment in my building. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a compact kitchenette and a creaky bed. But it was warm, secure, and close enough that we could check in with each other regularly. It felt incredible being able to do that for him, even though I was still far from wealthy. The sense of purpose that came from helping was worth more than the dollars themselves. In the following weeks, we fell into a new routine. Henry and I would scour online classifieds for upcoming garage or estate sales. Then on weekends, or whenever we found a promising lead, we'd hop in my old sedan and drive off to see if we could spot items with potential. He taught me how to identify the difference between genuine antique pieces and cheap knockoffs, how to research obscure markings on ceramics, and even how to gauge whether old electronics had collector value. At first, it was just one or two items here and there, sometimes a vintage lamp, sometimes a set of old comic books that might fetch a decent price from dedicated fans. Soon enough, my apartment started looking like a cross between a thrift store and a museum of forgotten knickknacks. Henry's place was the same, only smaller. We tried to maintain some order by immediately listing items online if we were confident in their value, but we also kept stashing interesting finds for further inspection. It got to the point where we had to be careful not to trip over random boxes as we navigated our own living spaces. My building's maintenance guy was probably suspicious about the parade of dusty vintage furniture I lugged upstairs, but he never said anything beyond a polite hello. Despite the chaos, we were actually making enough money to cover rent, utilities, and even enjoy a meal out once in a while. Each sale felt like a mini victory, a reminder that neither of us was bound to our past mistakes or the family baggage that had brought me here. Henry seemed more animated than ever, always coming up with fresh strategies to find the next hidden gem. We'd dive into online forums, reading up on unusual collectibles, and talk late into the evening about which neighborhoods were due for yard sales. The process wasn't without stumbles. A few times, we misjudged items we assumed were valuable, only to discover we'd wasted money on worthless junk. Still, the wins outnumbered the losses, and each time we turned a profit, I felt a stab of disbelief that this was actually working. In a weird way, I realized I never felt this fulfilled even during my busiest shifts at the family restaurant. This was my own enterprise, and I had the freedom to pivot any time I wanted. As the piles of antiques and random collectibles grew around me, I realized I was living in an entirely new world. One that was self-built, free of my parents' controlling gaze or my brother's arrogant smirks. Sure, it was a bit messy and my apartment resembled a cramped warehouse, but for once, I didn't mind. This was living proof that taking a risk could pay off. Henry and I often joked that we'd start calling ourselves the treasure hunters if we ever decided to make this official. No direct quote, but I suspect that was the gist of the banter we exchanged. Late at night, I sometimes replayed the last conversation I had with my family in my mind, the look on my brother's face when I walked out, and the humiliation I'd felt. Now, I saw it through a different lens. Maybe I needed that push, harsh as it was, to realize I could carve a life on my own terms. The painting sale and the subsequent finds were only the beginning, but they represented the first real step I'd taken outside that old shadow. The excitement built every time we found something new, every time a bid soared, and every time we paid our bills without worrying about where the money would come from. It was all happening so fast that I barely had time to process it. My only concern was keeping the momentum going and making sure Henry and I didn't let our success get to our heads. After all, we were still two people who'd been tossed aside in different ways, and we knew how quickly fortunes could change. That realization added a layer of caution, but also fueled our determination. We were resourceful enough to dig ourselves out of life's ditches, so who knew what we could accomplish if we kept pushing? Each day felt like a new chance to discover something overlooked, to polish it up, and to show the world it had worth. And in a sense, that's what we were doing for ourselves, too, reclaiming our value in a place that had once cast us aside. It was a heady mix of relief, excitement, and a deep hunger for more progress that kept me awake at night. Boxes and crates cluttered the corners of my apartment, but I couldn't complain. They were symbols of a second shot, a path that didn't involve wearing an apron at my parents' restaurant, or bowing to the demands of a boss who saw me as expendable. I was forging my own way, with an unlikely partner I'd met on a street curb. Life had a bizarre sense of humor, but I was grateful for it. Eventually, we realized we needed to be more systematic about this operation, maybe set up a dedicated space for our finds, or even an online storefront beyond basic auction sites. We talked about it in hushed tones, each of us aware that the next steps would require more planning and, yes, some real capital. But in the meantime, I sank into the day-to-day thrill of rummaging for a hidden treasure, listing it, and waiting to see if we'd struck gold or ended up with a dud. The best part was waking up to see new messages about an item we'd posted, or checking an online bidding war that had shot up unexpectedly. Every sale was validation that I wasn't trapped in a dead-end path. I'd found an alternative route, one that required hustle, courage, and a willingness to trust my instincts, and Henry's instincts, too. My apartment was no longer the lonely box it used to be. It bustled with activity, whether that was Henry dropping by to share tips on a new sale, or me sorting through old books to see if any were first editions. We had good days. We had days where nothing sold, but overall, we were on an upward climb. Each step felt like moving further away from the gloom of my past. That sense of forward momentum might have been the most important thing of all. I could practically see the future laid out before me, not as a perfect road, but as one filled with possibilities. The thought that I could earn a living on my own terms and provide shelter for someone else who needed a break was enough to keep me pushing forward. Even with the clutter piling up, it felt like real freedom, something that had been missing from my life for far too long. And that's how it went. Me and Henry, uncovering hidden gems, flipping them for profit, and proving to ourselves that we could do more than just endure. The city around us was still the same, full of bright lights and people oblivious to our little hustle. But inside my cramped apartment, A whole new chapter was unfolding. I was determined to see how far this path could stretch, and Henry was right there with me, offering his leftover business savvy when I got overwhelmed. Neither of us had all the answers, but maybe that was part of the adventure. We continued piling fines on every flat surface we could spare. Sometimes we joked about tripping over a priceless artifact in the middle of the night. Our places might have looked like a garage sale exploded inside, but every item told a story of potential. And as the weeks rolled on, we'd proven again and again that something as simple as a dusty painting could be a life changer. With each new discovery, the feeling grew stronger that I was finally on the right track. This wasn't just about making a quick buck. It was about creating a future that belonged solely to me. I had Henry to thank for pointing me in this direction, but we were both well aware that we were barely scratching the surface. There were bigger moves to make, bigger risks to take, and who knew what new surprises might come our way. For now, I focus on the present, sorting, listing, packing items for shipment, and relishing that sense of purpose. If life wanted to toss more curveballs, I felt ready to swing for the fences. After all, I had a rooftop over my head, a partner in crime who believed in second chances, and an unlikely business that actually paid the bills. That was more than I'd had in a long, long time. And the best part? It felt like this was only the beginning. I thought we'd found a good groove with our growing online resale hustle. Every day brought some new thrill. A vintage lamp that turned into a bidding war. A rare comic book that sold for triple what we paid. Henry and I were soaking up each success and learning from the occasional dud we picked up by mistake. It was messy, busy, and more than a little exciting. My cramped apartment was gradually transforming into a mini workshop, and Henry's own place was no better. We had stacks of old books, shelves full of figurines, and half-restored chairs shoved against every wall. It was nuts, yet we loved it. After a few months of juggling paintbrushes, sandpaper, and online listings, we realized we had a natural talent for touching up antique items to make them more appealing. It started with small fixes, tightening the joints on old chairs, polishing tarnished silverware, or patching flaking paint on decorative frames. Then it escalated to bigger projects, like refinishing wooden dressers or restoring intricate carvings on vintage cabinets. Henry had an eye for spotting what needed to be done, and I had the patience to do the detail work. We were no experts at first, but every successful flip taught us something new. Soon, people started noticing our posted photos weren't just random secondhand goods, but fully restored and carefully staged pieces. Buyers asked if we were professional restorers, and eventually we had to admit that, in a sense, we were becoming just that. It was wild to think we'd stumbled into a skill set that could turn dusty cast-offs into profit. We loved the idea that we were rescuing neglected art and furniture, giving these items a second shot at being cherished. Business took off to the point where we needed more room than my little living space and Henry's tiny studio could possibly handle. We started renting a bigger apartment in the same complex, one with an extra room for in-progress projects, and then we grabbed a modest storage unit for larger finds. Even then, it felt like the walls were closing in on us whenever we started on a new wave of purchases. The day I tried to navigate around a half-stripped armoire in my kitchen was when I realized we had to expand. We decided to rent a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It had an office attached, which we turned into a headquarters for sorting, listing, and planning. Now we had a place to stack unfinished pieces, a workshop area, and a separate corner for staging finished items. It was a major step up from the cluttered chaos we'd been living in. At first, it was nerve-wracking to commit to the cost of a warehouse and an actual office. Henry and I sat down with spreadsheets, making sure we weren't out over our skis financially. But every time we doubted the decision, we got another order or discovered another gem in an estate sale, and it felt like confirmation that we were on the right track. We named our new business Revive and Restore, a straightforward moniker that matched our story. Two guys who had been cast aside in one way or another, now reviving cast-off items for a new life. It was humbling to see how far we'd come from street corner chats and rummaging yard sales on a shoestring budget. Once we were settled in the new space, Henry started pushing me to consider broader investments. He insisted that making money was great, but letting money do the heavy lifting was even better. At first, I rolled my eyes. thinking this was some leftover corporate lingo from his old days. But when he explained how we could use part of our profits to invest in something more stable, something that would generate ongoing returns, I began to see sense in it. The question was, what exactly should we invest in? We batted around ideas. One was real estate, maybe fixing up a small duplex or a rundown property to rent out. Another was possibly partnering with a local artisan to open a boutique. But then we got an unexpected tip from a friend of a friend who mentioned a small eatery that was up for grabs. It was located in a part of the city that was just starting to revitalize, with new apartments and shops popping up. The owners were retiring, and they hadn't bothered to modernize. They just wanted out. Henry was more excited about it than I was at first. After all, my experience with restaurants mostly revolved around family headaches, not to mention the sour taste left by how my parents and brother had treated me. But Henry insisted this was different. We wouldn't be cogs in someone else's machine. We'd be the ones calling the shots, implementing creative ideas, and deciding exactly how to brand the place. He saw it as a blank canvas, a chance to fuse traditional fare with modern marketing strategies to stand out in a sea of fast food chains and generic diners. Before I knew it, I was caught up in the possibilities he described. I decided to use a chunk of our recent profits for a down payment on the eatery. I figured if everything tanked, I'd still have the antique restoration to fall back on. Henry was right there beside me, offering to partner up. We formalized everything, signed papers, and suddenly I was a co-owner of a restaurant that needed a massive overhaul. It was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. We got to work immediately. I knew how crucial social media and creative promotions could be after seeing how easily fresh ideas got attention online. Henry and I poured our hearts into brainstorming a menu that combined classic dishes with our own twists. Stuff that felt comforting, but had enough flair to make people curious. We set up an Instagram account to post pictures, tease new offerings, and responded to comments like we were all best friends. Henry's business acumen came in handy, too. We aimed for a vibe that felt modern but not pretentious, a place where you could bring a date or your grandma, and both would leave happy. It didn't take long for word of mouth to spread. At first, we had a slow trickle of curious locals who popped in to see what was new. Then a couple of well-known food bloggers visited, and their positive reviews lit a spark. Before we knew it, the weekend wait list stretched out the door, and we were expanding our staff. Every success was a little surreal. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but all signs pointed to growth. Henry was thrilled, and I found myself actually enjoying the restaurant world. Something I thought I'd never say after all the grief I'd endured at my family's place. As our business grew, I started hearing rumors that my family's restaurant was hitting rough waters. The old place had lost a lot of its spark, and customers were apparently flocking to other spots. Austin, the golden child who'd been handed everything on a silver platter, seemed to be struggling. Word was that he hadn't updated the menu or done any real marketing. My parents, who once bragged nonstop about their unstoppable family restaurant, were reportedly anxious about mounting bills. I felt a twinge of mixed emotions, part sadness, part vindication. After all, I'd spent years feeling like the nobody in that operation, only to discover I had more business sense than they'd ever given me credit for. Sure enough, a few weeks later, my parents showed up at our new restaurant. I was in the back with Henry, reviewing inventory, when a staff member let me know there were 2 people out front asking for me. My stomach did a somersault the minute I realized who it must be. I walked out to find my mom and dad standing awkwardly near the hostess stand, trying to ignore the friendly bustle around them. They looked tired and stressed, worlds away from the confident power couple who used to run the biggest dining spot in town. They hinted that the family restaurant was in real trouble, debts piling up, customers dwindling, and made a vague plea for assistance. They even tried praising my success, as if to say I was the only one who could rescue them from this crisis. I remembered standing in that cramped back room not too long ago, being tossed an envelope with a measly $20 bill. The irony was too strong. A wave of cold anger washed through me, but I kept my expression neutral. I told them that I wasn't in a position to fix their problems. It wasn't a lie. I had my own business to run, my own staff to pay. Then, on a whim, I reached into my wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and handed it over. It felt petty and symbolic, but I couldn't resist. It was a mirror of the day they dismissed me so casually. For a second, they stared at the bill, clearly remembering how they'd once done the same thing to me. That's when they started claiming I owed them. They said if I had any success now, it was only because they taught me everything I knew. They argued that since we were a family, I was obligated to help. I stood there, feeling my pulse thrum in my temples. They had never truly shown me the ropes. All they'd done was give me chores and brush off my ideas. I let them know, as calmly as I could, that my real lessons had come from Henry, a stranger on the street who saw potential in me. In barely over a year, he'd shown me more respect and guidance than my family had in 2 decades. Their faces twisted with anger or maybe embarrassment. They tried to put me down, implying I was still just a reckless kid playing businessman. I could feel the tension in the air, and so could the customers, a few of whom had paused their meals to watch the unfolding drama. One even discreetly raised the phone to capture what was happening. That was the moment Henry emerged from back, taking in the scene with a stony expression. He calmly informed my parents that if they caused any more disruption, he'd have security escort them out. He made it clear that we didn't welcome bullying or intimidation in our establishment. They sputtered a few more insults in our direction, but the damage was done. Their composure was shattered, and everyone saw it. With heads hanging, they shuffled out, carrying the humiliating $20 bill with them. The door closed behind them, and a stunned silence settled over the dining area. One by one, customers resumed their meals, some whispering about what they'd just witnessed. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, an odd mix of triumph, guilt, and sadness. But I knew deep down that this confrontation was long overdue. Henry and I exchanged a nod. This restaurant, our restaurant, was thriving because of our hard work, our willingness to adapt, and our focus on genuine innovation. Everything about it was the opposite of how my family's place had been run. While part of me regretted sinking to the level of symbolic pettiness, handing them that $20 felt like a final break in the chain that had always linked me to their disapproval. I reminded myself that I hadn't asked for any of this conflict. They showed up at my doorstep, not the other way around. I found it ironic that a random onlooker had probably captured the entire confrontation on their phone. Social media being what it was, I wouldn't be surprised if the video eventually made its rounds, showcasing how the old powerhouse family got turned away by the son they once brushed off. The moral of the story was clear to me. At least, never underestimate someone you think is beneath you. You never know when they'll build something far bigger than you ever imagined. After my parents left, Henry quietly asked if I was okay. I gave him a shrug and admitted I felt a little rattled, but mostly relieved. I wasn't the same person who walked out of that old restaurant in the rain. Now I had real achievements under my belt, people who believed in me, and a thriving business that owed nothing to my family's condescending support. In fact, I was the one in a position to lend a hand if I chose to, but I didn't. Maybe that was harsh, but I wasn't about to bail them out just because they felt entitled to it. Despite the tension, the day carried on. Customers kept ordering. The kitchen hummed with activity, and I had tasks to handle. Yet I couldn't fully shake the mix of emotions. I guess there'd be fallout from this, maybe even a last-ditch effort from my parents and brother. Part of me dreaded the idea of a public feud, but another part welcomed the closure. I'd spent years feeling like I owed them something, but now I realized all I truly owed was myself. To keep pushing forward, building the life I wanted. That evening, I locked up the restaurant with Henry, noticing how the sign out front glowed in the dark, a beacon that symbolized everything we'd accomplished. The memory of my family's desperate faces lingered in my thoughts, but I pushed it aside. If they wanted to salvage their failing restaurant, they'd have to figure out on their own. I walked away from that encounter feeling a new sense of confidence. For the first time, I was completely unafraid of what they might say or think, because I wasn't under their shadow anymore. Henry and I headed back to the warehouse office, where a stack of new antique items waited to be cleaned and photographed. Our phone buzzed with notifications from social media, likely more interest in the restaurant. Another shipment of supplies was due in the morning. We had staff schedules to finalize, new marketing ideas to test, and a dozen other tasks that came with running two thriving businesses. In short, we were busy, we were focused, and we were winning. And I had no intention of letting old family baggage derail what we'd built. Sleep was far off my mind, but I didn't mind. The warehouse smelled like sawdust and fresh paint, a reminder of everything we were restoring, both literally and figuratively. I sank into a chair, letting the day's events replay in my head. Henry started rummaging for a box of spare hardware we'd need for tomorrow's projects. We didn't talk much. There wasn't a need. We both understood that we had something special here, something that went beyond flipping antiques or running a restaurant. We had the chance to rewrite our stories. I knew that life wasn't always going to be smooth sailing. Challenges would pop up, some bigger than my parents' desperate pleas. But I felt prepared to face them. With Henry at my side, the skilled staff at the restaurant, and the knowledge that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet, the future looked promising. Sure, the day's confrontation still rattled me, but also freed me. My family had finally witnessed who I'd become, and their scorn no longer had any power over me. As we tidied up the workshop of the night, I caught a glimpse of a half-restored dresser that symbolized what we did best, turning something worn down into something brand new. It reminded me that transformation was possible for anyone, including me. I had no idea what further twists and turns lay ahead, but I felt ready for them. Tomorrow, we'd wake up and keep grinding, keep building, and keep proving that a so-called dreamer could succeed when given the right opportunity and a solid ally. For now, I let out a slow exhale, reflecting on the evening's drama and how it all felt like a climax of the story that started ages ago. The memory of that symbolic $20 bill lingered in my mind, a reminder of how far I'd come and how drastically the tables had turned. Whatever happened next, I was sure of one thing. I wasn't going back to who I used to be. The success we had was a product of our sweat and strategy, not some inherited legacy. And that was something no one could ever take from me. Things had been steady for a while after that showdown with my parents, the one where Henry practically shoved them out of our restaurant with a reminder that we ran the place on our own terms. My life had settled into a brisk but satisfying rhythm, shuttling between the warehouse where we restored antiques, overseeing our growing staff, and dropping by our restaurant to keep tabs on menu changes and social media feedback. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls from folks wanting custom refinishing jobs or brand collaborations. It felt like the hustle never ended, but I was thriving on it. One morning, just as I was stepping into the office at our warehouse, I got wind of a rumor. My brother Austin was sniffing around the local business community, trying to dig up dirt on me. Some of our suppliers hinted that he'd made not-so-subtle remarks, suggesting I was engaging in shady dealings or had leveraged illegal tactics to rise to success. It sounded over the top and, frankly, desperate, but I knew Austin too well to dismiss it outright. He'd always been a smooth talker, and he had a knack for cozying up to people with influence. I mentioned it to Henry over a quick lunch in our office. He looked thoughtful, but not particularly surprised. We both knew the failing family restaurant was on its last legs, and Austin was the type to pull a final stunt rather than go down gracefully. He might have guessed I wouldn't bail them out, so he'd apparently decided to play dirty instead. My first instinct was to confront him, but Henry suggested we keep a cool head and turn Austin's own strategy against him. If we handled this right, we could give him just enough rope to create his own downfall. We spent a few days quietly gathering information, talking with our contacts and watching Austin's moves. Henry coached me through the steps like he was teaching a crash course in corporate warfare. The idea was simple. Let Austin believe I was vulnerable, then dangle an opportunity so tempting he wouldn't be able to resist exploiting it. Once he took the bait, he'd walk right into a deal too big for him to manage, leaving the door open for a major financial slip. I decided to plant the rumor that I was expanding aggressively, looking for partnerships across town. Through carefully placed gossip, we hinted that I was eager to invest in a big, flashy project. We knew it would get back to Austin because he was hungry for any chance to undermine me. Sure enough, it worked. Within a week, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Austin was gloating about how he convinced me to team up with him on a surefire venture. In reality, I'd never spoken to Austin, but he apparently thought he was about to lure me into a deal that would collapse under my supposed ignorance. Instead, Henry helped me file some paperwork that led to a property acquisition Austin had been eyeing. We nudged Austin's connections into thinking the deal was sweet, only for him to realize too late that the building in question needed massive repairs, held hidden liens, and was located in an area with new zoning restrictions. By the time he realized he'd bitten off more than he could chew, he was locked into obligations he couldn't wriggle out of. Worse yet, he'd used whatever remained of the family restaurant's funds as collateral. When the news broke, the local business scene buzzed with talk of Austin's ill-fated move. It spelled doom for my parents' restaurant. Apparently, they'd tried cutting corners, but the debts dwarfed any last-minute rescue efforts. Their once famous place struggled on for a few more weeks with dismal customer counts, then finally had to throw in the towel. I heard from old friends around town that my parents were in a state of shock, refusing to believe this was the end. Austin tried to call me a few times, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Part of me felt bad for not picking up, but I remembered how he'd done everything he could to smear me and bring me down. There wasn't much left to say. Word got around that the building itself was going up for auction to satisfy creditors. Henry and I looked at each other, immediately knowing what we had to do. It wasn't about revenge. Okay, maybe a small part was, but mostly it felt like a chance to close this chapter once and for all. The building had good bones in a prime location. With some modern upgrades, it could be transformed into a flagship location for our restaurant brand, a shining example of how times had changed. So we pooled our resources, made a strategic bid, and walked away as the new owners of the very property my family had once lorded over. Stepping into that familiar building felt surreal. The old decor was still there, the same booths, the same faded pictures on the walls that I'd grown up washing. Even the kitchen equipment showed signs of decades-old grease traps. My mind flashed back to the countless shifts I'd spent scrubbing floors while Austin got all the credit. Now, I stood there with the keys in my hand, free to decide the place's future. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I spared no expense in the renovation. We brought in a talented design team, updated the entire layout, and gave it a sleek, modern feel. We kept some nostalgic elements. Photos of the city from yesteryear, small nods to classic American diners, but everything else got a fresh look. We hired smart, social media-savvy staff who knew how to engage customers online. The menu took inspiration from our existing restaurant, but added a few exclusive dishes that showcased local flavors with a unique spin. Henry masterminded the rollout, making sure influencers and local news outlets got an early look. The buzz began before construction even wrapped up. While all this was happening, I was aware my parents and Austin were in freefall. Their finances were shot, their reputation damaged by the bankrupt business. Rumor had it they sold off most of their possessions just to stay afloat. It wasn't a fate I took any real joy in, but I wasn't about to swoop in and rescue them. They'd made their choices, and so had I. Henry and I continued building our brand, determined to make this new flagship restaurant the hottest spot in town. When opening day finally arrived, the lines were even longer than we'd anticipated. People poured in, curious to see the transformation of a building that once symbolized traditional family cooking. Now it was an embodiment of new school thinking, social media campaigns, creative dishes, and a vibe that bridged the gap between casual and upscale. It felt like a culmination of every risk I'd ever taken, every insult I'd endured. That day, I couldn't help feeling proud of the journey from being the overlooked dishwasher to the owner of a buzzing restaurant chain. I got wind that my parents had peeked in at some point, though they didn't come inside. They must have been stunned by the changes. Everything from the new sign to the upscale interior likely drove home the fact that their era was officially over. Part of me wondered if they felt regret or if they doubled down on bitterness. At that point, it didn't really matter. I was too busy welcoming customers and coordinating with the staff. The place was at full capacity, and the social media feed was blowing up with positive feedback. Henry and I took a moment during the soft opening to stand back and watch it all unfold. The hustle of servers carrying plates to happy guests, the laughter rising from tables, the steady hum of a healthy business. It was a stark contrast to the gloom that used to hang over the spot. I felt a small measure of closure, seeing how everything had come full circle. That evening, when the doors finally closed, I slipped into what used to be the old manager's office. My dad's old workspace, basically. The walls had been repainted and the furniture replaced, but I still remembered how it smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. Standing there, I thought about all the times I'd been brushed aside and told I'd never amount to more than a dreamer. I realized I owed a massive debt of gratitude to Henry, not just for the guidance, but for believing in me when nobody else would. We'd built all this from scratch, and we'd done it with grit, creativity, and a willingness to learn from our missteps. Over the next few days, the online reviews poured in, praising the new establishment as a breath of fresh air. Our other locations saw a boost too, mostly because everyone wanted to see how else we'd innovate. Each bit of good news reminded me that all the backbreaking work, the late nights refurbishing dusty antiques, the leap of faith into our first restaurant investment had paid off. In a sense, I finally felt the weight of my family's legacy lift off my shoulders, replaced by something I crafted with my own hands. As for Austin and my parents, they more or less vanished from my radar. Sometimes I caught a stray rumor about them staying with a distant relative or trying to find some new venture, but it never stuck. They'd lost their empire and had no one to bail them out this time. Some folks might call that karma. Others might call it simply the result of poor choices. Either way, the outcome was the same. Their old building, once the shining centerpiece of our town, had a new life, and this time, it actually welcomed innovation and fresh thinking. One afternoon, a friend showed me a local news article covering the transformation. The reporter talked about how the city was changing, how younger entrepreneurs were bringing fresh energy, and how a once famous landmark had been reclaimed and reinvented by a new generation. They praised my restaurant approach to community engagement and modern marketing, hinting that this was exactly what the area needed to stay relevant. It was a nice feeling, though I tried not to let it go to my head. Henry and I were only just getting started. We had a stable of antiques to restore, another restaurant idea on the horizon, and a bunch of employees counting on us. There was too much to do to get stuck patting ourselves on the back. Sometimes, late at night, I'd reflect on how everything unfolded. If my parents had given me a real chance all those years, would I have become this driven? If Austin hadn't antagonized me, would I have learned how to stand up for myself and outmaneuver him? Hard to say. I wasn't exactly grateful for all the pain, but in a twisted way, I recognized it had shaped my ambition. I was stronger because I had to be. I was more resourceful because no one handed me success on a platter. In the end, I had no regrets. My family's old restaurant had become the flagship of my growing chain, a gleaming testament to what vision and hustle could accomplish. My brother's attempt to ruin me had backfired spectacularly, leaving him with nothing. My parents' betrayal and years of indifference had led me right to Henry's doorstep, where I discovered the confidence and strategy one needed. The small-town kid they once dismissed had become a business owner with a knack for spotting opportunities in the places everyone else overlooked. It felt like the perfect conclusion to a story I never imagined would turn out in my favor. Walking through the modernized dining area one last time before closing, I felt that sense of satisfaction swell in my chest. The lights glowed softly, highlighting the sleek decor we'd installed. The aromas of the day's cooking still lingered. Outside, a handful of late-night guests were finishing up their meals on the patio. Henry was in the back, likely double-checking the books or chatting with staff. There was no more anxiety about my family's interference or doubts about my own capability. I stepped outside, flipped the sign to close, and locked up with the calm assurance that I'd finally claimed my future. And for once, it was entirely mine.